Good evening. In AD 208, the Emperor Septimius Severus, aged 63, but, as one of the historical sources tells us, in his heart more enthusiastic than any youth, set out for Britain, knowing, we're told, from astrology and omens, that he would not return and would die in his third year in the island. The astrologers were correct. With him travelled his wife, Julia Domna, his co-Augustus and 20-year-old elder son, Caracalla, his younger son, Gaeta. You see these characters on this painting done some years before the expedition to Britain. And with them the whole of the imperial court and retinue. After careful preparations, while Gaeta and trusted officials administered the Roman Empire, ran the whole of the Roman Empire from York, a vast army, led in person by Severus and Caracalla, moved into what is now Scotland. The 1800th anniversary of the death of Severus at York in February 211 provides a pretext for looking again at what we know of the great Severian expedition and the motives that lay behind it, as well as its consequences for the people of northeast Scotland. And I'm very grateful to the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland for inviting me here to do this evening. And I'm going to approach it under a series of headings, the first of which is what really brought Severus to Britain. Well, one of our sources, the Herodian, I'll come to those historical sources and say a bit more about them in a moment, claims that the governor of Britain informed the emperor by dispatches that the barbarians were in revolt and overrunning the country. He told Severus that he needed either a stronger army for the defense of the province or the presence of the emperor himself. Severus was delighted with this news. It was long ago pointed out that the governor's appeal to the emperor is probably a literary topos or cliché. And some would follow the sources in seeing the concern of the emperor to give his dissolute sons a taste of military life as being the decisive motive in coming to Britain. More recently, one historian, Boris Rankov, has argued that the expedition was as much concerned with re-establishing the loyalty of the army as it was with dealing with barbarian incursions or the conquest of Scotland for its own sake. I think there are problems with this kind of perspective. If that really was the motive for Severus coming to Britain, why did he leave it so long to do this? He was freed up from his other main preoccupation, his Eastern wars, by 201. He could have come to Britain then. On the other hand, troubled relationships and warfare with the peoples beyond Hadrian's Wall are persistently cited in the historian Cassius Dio through the period from the 190s onwards. And the most balanced conclusion is that a situation of worsening frontier trouble, worsening relationships with the peoples beyond the Roman frontier, combined with the undoubted personal desire of an energetic and belligerent emperor to take the field and solve the problem. So, the next of our sections, we turn to the question of the target. Where were the Roman attentions directed? Well, we're told quite a lot about this directly in one of the sources. the peoples beyond the frontier in Britain were named as the Maiatae, probably occupying the northern Scottish lowlands, the Antonine Wall area and Fife. And the Caledonia, living further north, the boundary, their southern boundary possibly being the River Tay. We can see that whole area. It shows up white on this map of Scotland. It is, of course, a largely lowland, fertile area in contrast to the highlands, and, of course, extends round into Moray. And this really was the seat of the peoples, which it seems that the Roman expedition was directed. One of our sources specifically states that Severus started by invading Caledonia, the northern of these two areas, suggesting that the Maiatae immediately came to terms and allowed their territory to be used as a springboard. The name Maiatae is heard of for the first time in the late 2nd century, on the eve of the Severan campaigns. And Caledonia, although not a new name, now apparently had a much wider application. As Cassius Dio wrote, the names of all other peoples had become merged in these two. Now, this does not mean that there was a real amalgamation or political unity. These names are Roman, not indigenous applications. But a newly emerged regional response to the Roman Empire is indicated. In this case, much more northeast-centred than the southwest Scotland area, which seems to have been the source of opposition in the days of Hadrian and Antoninus Pius. With the Roman Empire as a permanent neighbour, society in northeast Scotland changed. After the abandonment of the Antonine Wall around AD 160, ability to play the Roman Empire for subsidies or to raid the Roman province might have rapidly overtaken traditional routes to status. Excavations at Burney, way up on the Moray Firth, have given an insight into a specific, presumably Caledonian settlement of this period, where hordes of Severan subsidy denarii dating to the 190s have been found. Despite the lurid descriptions of the Greek historians, these people were not utterly alien to the invading Romans. The leading warriors of northeast Scotland were on familiar terms with the Roman Empire and its officials. It's important to realise that the campaigns that we're talking about tonight were an aberration within a long-running imperial policy of dealing with the trans-frontier peoples by means of silver coin subsidies, present giving, hostage taking, and treaties. This was standard frontier management policy, and much of it can be read directly in the literary sources that we have for northern Britain. Well, next I want to turn to the historical evidence for the course of the campaigns. Now, don't try to read this complicated looking table. The evidence on which it's based, well, we have three main sources of written evidence. There are legends on Roman coins, and then there are the works of two historians, Cassius Dio and Herodian. Dio, from Bithynia, what is now modern Turkey, was a direct contemporary, a senator who governed military provinces, and somebody who knew the Emperor Septimius Severus personally. On one level, he should clearly have a good knowledge and an understanding of a military expedition of this period. But he is also extremely hostile to Septimius Severus. He wrote, for example, about the accession of the emperor: his actions showed clearly that he possessed none of the qualities of a good ruler. And if he was hostile to Severus, he was even more hostile to Caracalla. And on top of all that, only excerpts, the sexy snippets of the relevant part of a history survive. The other source, Herodian, also an Easterner, an official in Rome who wrote a history of the empire in his times, gives less information, is even more gossipy, frequently unreliable, although, to balance that, he was also a direct contemporary. Both histories are in Greek, not Latin. Well, the sources indicate an imperial departure from Rome in 208, a campaign led by Severus and Caracalla, a surrender, and then a revolt, first by the Maeatae, then rapidly joined by the Caledonia. A second campaign, which had to be conducted by Caracalla alone, because Severus was too infirm to travel north from York, during the course of which Severus died. It's not really clear whether the first campaign was launched in 208 or 209 or extended over both years. If Caracalla continued active campaigning immediately after his father's death in February 211, it must have been very brief. He and Gaeta were certainly back in Rome by the end of the year, and probably as early as April. So the table, which as I said, I don't want you to absorb in detail, just illustrates how you can combine the three basic sources of written evidence we have to produce a rudimentary chronology. Well, I turn next to the archaeology of the Severan expedition. Owing to the extreme vagueness of both sources, the best we get in terms of actual geographical information is from Cassius Dio. Severus did not desist until he had approached the extremity of the island. The only evidence we really have for the extent on the ground of the Severan campaigning is provided by archaeology. But as we'll see, there are severe problems with that evidence also. We're on our firmest ground with the supply bases for the expedition, far south of the theatre of war. And these have been identified at Corbridge, here where Deer Street, the main Roman road north, crosses Hadrian's Wall and heads into Scotland, and at South Shields at the mouth of the River Tyne. Here's the situation of the fort and supply base at South Shields. It sits right on the top of this promontory here at the mouth of the river. This was a place where supplies gathered from southern Britain, possibly even the continent, were stored in huge quantities, ready for transshipment north to the theatre of war. At South Shields, a very rare series of datable lead ceilings. These are rather like wax ceilings, made of lead rather than wax, for sealing up consignments or packages. It looks very large on the slide, which doesn't have a scale, but it's actually the size of your fingernail, this seal, which shows the portrait of Severus at the centre, Caracalla here, and Gaeta on the right, and above, just in case there's any doubt about who these sinister-looking characters are, the legend AUGG, the Augusti, the emperors. The finding of many of these sealings at South Shields from the 19th century onwards has shown that the supplies for an imperial expedition were passing through a supply base which contained, at its maximum extent, 24 granaries before the autumn of 209. We know that because on these seals, Gaeta here on the right has not yet been elevated to the rank of Augustus, which it is thought he attained in autumn 209. About 10 years ago, which is about the time my colleague Paul Bidwell came to speak to this society about the Severan supply base at South Shields, about 10 years ago, a number of these seals were discovered in the construction levels of a second phase enlargement of the supply base, showing that it reached its maximum extent, presumably in 209. The first phase had never been completed, and so belongs to the inception of the campaigns in 208, or just possibly to the immediately preceding governorship of Alphanus Senecio in 205-8. That's the first phase of development, the incomplete phase of the supply base at South Shields. You notice the distinctive buttressed granary buildings filling up the whole of the northern half of the fort enclosure. The buildings in the southern half, south of this dividing wall, have never been completed, and the whole thing rapidly overtaken by an extension in the number of granaries, as I say, presumably in the year 209, bringing us up to the total of 24 or so, and some accommodation for a military unit in the southern part of the supply base here, which I'll return to a bit later on. The finding of these seals, stratified in this way, proves once and for all that the South Shield supply base originated with the Severan campaigns and not earlier, under the Emperor Commodus in the 180s, as some have from time to time suggested over the years. That's just a view over some of the granaries of the supply base of South Shields at the time, in about 10 years ago, when these stratified ceilings were discovered. A further lead ceiling, marked AUGGG, 3 Gs, from South Shields, shows that after Gaeta had been elevated to the rank of Augustus in autumn 209, the supply base served a further campaign, presumably that of 210, the one that followed the revolt of the Maeatai and the Caledonia. The enlarged supply base at South Shields was capable of holding grain rations, or it's been calculated, I should say, we don't have any documentation for this, this has been calculated that the enlarged supply base was capable of holding grain rations for 25,000 men for 168 days, or just under 6 months. Well, moving from the supply bases to the archaeology on the ground in Scotland, it's traditional to associate 2 of the recognisable series of marching camps in Scotland to the Severan campaigns, the 63-acre and the 130-acre groups. In the past, the 63-acre camps, which you see there, you see they fall into, or they appear to fall into 2 distinct lines of advance on the map. In the past, these have been associated with the first campaign, showing the lines of march taken by Severus and Caracalla. And the 130-acre camps then represent the second campaign undertaken by Caracalla alone, with the whole army united. Now all of this is very attractive and makes a beautiful story, but there is no direct dating evidence for any of these camps, and the link with the Severan period is purely circumstantial. These camps are, however, post-Flavian. They are later than the 1st century in date, it seems. This is suggested by the sequence of superimposed camps at Ardoch, where excavation has shown that the larger ones, this is one of the 63-acre series here, this huge one is one of the 130-acre ones. They are in fact earlier than they are the latest ones in the sequence. They are later than the smaller camps which underlie them. But there are various other complications. It has recently been claimed that the Ardoch-Bertha Road, Antonine in construction at the latest, overlies one of the 63-acre series, which, if correct, would remove them from the Severan equation. If any of these camps are truly Severan, it seems most likely that it's the 130-acre ones, but we can base no, without further dating evidence, we can't really put any great weight on that. However, there is another development to do with camps, or there is a development to do with camps, which is that radiocarbon dating now rules out a Severan date for another series of camps, 110 acres in size, not actually shown on this map, which extend from the Stonehaven area all the way up to the Moray Firth. These were in the past thought to be Severan, but recently published work at Kintore now confirms once and for all that that series of camps is Flavian, 1st century in date. And although the excavator has suggested possible reuse in later campaigns, none of the published dates from ovens in the camp necessarily lies outside the 1st century in date range. There is thus now no archaeological suggestion that Severus marched as far north as the Moray Firth. The distribution of those camps that are most likely to be Severan, the 130-acre series, suggests an advance to the Stonehaven area and no further. Moving on to the permanent sites, that Cramond, of course very close to where we are this evening in the outskirts of Edinburgh, is one of only 2 permanent Roman military bases in Scotland known to have been occupied at the time of the Severan expedition. It's a large fort, 2.5 hectares, and it had a very large annex attached to its eastern side, unfortunately not shown on this plan, but a very large annex over here on the eastern side of the fort. A gate and defences having been found recently some 275 metres distant from the east side of the fort. An annex which accommodated manufacturing activities, including the making of furniture and window frames for a very high status residence. An altar was dedicated at Cramond, probably, not certainly, in the Severan period, by the commander of this unit, Cohors Quinta Gallorum, the 5th cohort of Gauls. Now, they're of interest as being the unit which is also attested in the Severan period at South Shields, at the Severan supply base at South Shields, which we've just been looking at. And this seems to create a link between the two sites. And it's often been suggested that the unit was perhaps split between the two sites in the Severan period. The Severan supply base at South Shields has insufficient accommodation for the whole of this unit. I showed that accommodation on a plan a couple of slides ago. So that would in fact support this traditional suggestion. So we envisage a unit of maritime speciality administering the supply base at South Shields at the same time as the forward base at Cramond. Only one other permanent site of the Severan period is known in Scotland, and that is Carpool on the Firth of Tay. This is a large fortress, almost 10 hectares in size. That's about half the size of a standard 2nd century legionary fortress, but much, much bigger than your usual auxiliary Roman fort. It has a dramatic position on the south side of the Firth of Tay, at the point where the Erne and the Tay meet. I apologise to Colin Martin for having stolen this marvellous photograph from the internet. This is the site of the fortress here. You can just make out its some of its ditches. This is the eastern end of it here, showing up as a crop mark. And remember this slide, because we'll mention in a moment the possibility that there was actually a Roman bridge across the Tay at this point in the Severan period. And if that's correct, this is where it's likely to have been. That's a plan of the fortress in its setting from a different angle from the previous photograph. This is the River Tay up here. The direction we were looking in a moment ago was from the top of the slide, as it were. And simply another view of it from ground level. You can see the rampart of the fortress here as a rippling earthwork in this field in the centre of the slide. So we're looking over the fortress and over the Firth of Tay towards the Sidlaw Hills in the background. The land of Caledonia, if our early interpretation of the literary sources is correct. The fortress has produced tile stamps of the 20th Legion and fragments of a gate inscription employing symbols of the 2nd Legion. This is the controversial and mysterious inscription from Carpool. Here are the legionary symbols I was talking about a moment ago. But you see, the big problem with this magnificent inscription, which would have been about 6 meters long when complete, is that only fragments of 4 or 5 letters of the actual text survive, and it is not possible to restore it certainly in order to provide a firm date or imperial reign. There was a brave attempt by R.P. Wright to restore it, to show the titles of a single emperor, Caracalla. So in this view, the fortress isn't built till 212 or so, in the immediate aftermath of the Severan campaigns. But as you can see, there just isn't enough to be certain about this. And I think we have to accept that. Not his interpretation, I mean. We just have to accept that for the time being it's impossible to restore this text with any confidence. Excavations at the site of the fortress between 1964 and 1979 were finally published in the Proceedings of this Society in 1999. So there is a body of data there to digest. Carpool, as I alluded to a few minutes ago, is often thought to be the place where the Tay could have been crossed by a bridge of boats, commemorated on a coin of 209 and vaguely alluded to in the literary sources. The situation of the fortress and the earlier crossing of the Firth of Tay implied there does seem to confirm that the Roman objective was the area of Angus and lowland Perthshire towards which the 130-acre marching camps lead. Now, the idea has long been floated that the fortress at Carpou may actually not be Severan, that it may have been founded in connection with an earlier set of campaigns, specifically those of Ulpius Marcellus in the early 180s. Now this tendency has gathered pace. The recent article from John Casey, and no less an authority than Roger Tomlin editing the new volume 3 of the Roman Inscriptions of Britain, saying that the fragmentary Eastgate inscription should be, and I quote, should be provisionally attributed to Commodus. The basic reasons are that it has not been possible to restore the imperial titles to any form paralleled in the Severan period, and the use of this very striking ornamentation, the so-called beak-headed pelti, to decorate the ends of the inscription. And these are actually seen also on another fragmentary inscription from Carpou. This one from the south gate, the big inscription I just showed you, is from the east gate of the fortress. This is from another gate. This doesn't have any inscription at all surviving, but you see the same sort of decorative motif there. Now, these so-called beak-headed pelti are indeed usually a sign of Antonine date. They're very common, for example, on the Antonine wall distance slabs. But neither of the arguments is decisive. The inscription can't be restored to anything that can be paralleled in Commodus's reign either. And the pelta motif adorns this inscription from York, which probably dates to the 190s. In short, if this motif could occur at Carpou in the 180s, a full 40 years after the Antonine wall distance slabs, it seems to me impossible to be confident that it could not still occur 25 years later under the Severans. Some recent writers have also invoked an argument that the stamped tiles from the site are of a type that was passing out of use around 180. But the dating of the typology of these tiles, which is by a scholar called Worry, relies entirely on the stamps of military units, which in themselves cannot be closely dated. The date range for the tile type is open-ended, as Worry himself concedes in his work on the subject, and it is simply unsustainable on present evidence to claim that we can pinpoint a type of tile that could have been made around 185, but not around 210 or so. The coins from the Carpou excavations, of which the latest dates to 207, have also been taken to indicate a period of occupation before the Severan campaigns. I'll return to that point a little later. The pottery recovered from the site paralleled exactly that, dominated by types such as black burnished ware category 2 and related Thames estuary products, which at South Shields does not occur in any quantity before the construction of the Severan supply base. And that, above all, is my own personal reason for believing that Carpu was probably not constructed until the Severan period. Looking at it more circumstantially, if it was possible to maintain a legionary fortress on the Tay throughout the period between 185 and 205, one wonders why the massive Severan expedition would have been necessary at all. In fact, Ulpius Marcellus, having campaigned in retribution for the breaching of Hadrian's Wall by a barbarian invasion in the 180s, seems to have withdrawn from enemy territory. The fort at Newstead was given up about this time. And he managed the trans-frontier peoples through treaties. Those that we hear from our literary sources were being broken in the 190s. Commodern policy in Britain can be compared to that on the contemporary Danube frontier, where, in return for undertakings, Roman armies were withdrawn from barbarian territory and subsidies paid. So despite the difficulties surrounding the Carpu inscription, the impossibility of dating it, the circumstantial and archaeological evidence, particularly the clear Severan date of the South Shield supply base and the similarity of the pottery found within it to that at Carpu, favours a fortress founded in connection with the Severan expedition. Well, the next topic I'd like to tackle is what had been the real objectives of the Severan expedition. Well, Cassius Dio writes, wishing to subjugate the whole of the island, Severus invaded Caledonia. This definition of a war aim by a contemporary who would have known the truth has led to a widespread assumption that Severus wanted to do away with Hadrian's Wall and absorb Scotland into the province. That this was the last chance for the conquest of the whole of Britain to be effected, frustrated only by the death of Severus before his enterprise could be completed, and by the lack of interest of his successor, Caracalla. It's also commonly been thought that there was a sudden U-turn from frontier building to imperial expansion in 208, for inscriptions show that the forts on Hadrian's Wall underwent a major program of refurbishment in the years immediately prior to the arrival of the emperors, this building work taking place under the governor Alphanus Senecio around 205-8. And this work probably extended to the wall itself to such an extent that by later historians Severus was credited with the first building of Hadrian's Wall, or what we now know as Hadrian's Wall. Severus is often characterized as an expansionist, but elsewhere his frontier advances did not always entail networks of forts and the development of a provincial landscape. New forts were advanced into the Wadi Siran in Arabia and into the Libyan desert. But in these cases, no new directly governed territory was enclosed within the empire. They were rather like military antennae projected out into a zone outside the provinces of the Roman Empire. With this in mind, it's perhaps wrong to think that the intention in 208-11 was to occupy and directly govern Scotland, certainly the whole of it. There was at least 3 years of opportunity to build roads and forts other than the boldly projected coastal outposts of Cramond and Carpu. But it's striking that nothing like the Antonine fort and road network was even begun. So just to look at this on a map, this is Antonine Scotland, and you see the density of military occupation, with forts of varying sizes spread evenly over the landscape, a network of roads. There would have been time to begin this in the Severan period, but we see nothing like it. And my suspicion is that this shows us a change in Roman attitude, that the Roman response to frontier problems had shifted in the 2 or 3 generations between Antoninus Pius and Septimius Severus from expansion of directly Roman occupied territory to management of neighbouring peoples through aggressive and far-reaching war. Possibly we should see this as presaging the character of 4th century Roman policy 4th century Roman frontier policy in Europe, where emperors take aggressive action against specific peoples beyond the frontier, but at the same time invest in frontier defences and in frontier lines which have become irredeemably fixed. Seen in this light, there's no contradiction between the Severan work in restoring Hadrian's Wall and the subsequent invasion of Scotland. Nor is it really incompatible with the language of Cassius Dio when he speaks of the aim being to subjugate the whole island. To subjugate does not necessarily mean to assimilate into the Roman Empire, as they would have wanted to do in the 1st century. Carpu itself is not suitable for a campaign base, as it has sometimes been described. It could only have held about 3,000 men, a fraction of the 25,000 plus that the 130-acre camps will have been able to accommodate, and which was a recurrent size for campaigning armies in Roman times. It makes more sense as a permanent, coastally supplied outpost for a powerful force of legionaries and perhaps auxiliary cavalry to maintain watch over the Caledonian heartland, and hence, in my opinion, fits best into the phase following the expedition itself. If it seems a remote and far-flung outpost, there are plenty of parallels to be found. For example, the outpost forts around the Black Sea coast beyond Rome's Euphrates frontier. I apologise for the rather sketchy nature of this map. But you see where we are here. This is the eastern end of the Black Sea. There's the Caucasus. This is the Caspian Sea. This is the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire. And the river in eastern Turkey, down the river Euphrates. But way beyond that, around the Black Sea coast, there were for long periods Roman forts, considerable Roman forts. They extend much further from the Roman Empire than Carpu did from Hadrian's Wall, but the intervals between the individual military sites and anchorages are closely comparable to what we see in Scotland. 120 kilometres between Phasis and Sebastopolis here matches very closely the 120 kilometre sail from Cramond to Carpu. As well as the control and periodic ravaging of the Caledonia, the establishment of a system of coastal outpost forts may well have been an aim from the outset. The ambitious scale and permanence of the stone supply base at South Shields indicates that seaborne support for such a far-flung series of outposts was envisaged from the beginning. Well, finally, the last question I want to address is what did the campaigns achieve? What was their legacy? Cassius Dio says of Caracalla that after his father's death, with the enemy he came to terms. He withdrew from their territory and abandoned the forts. The absence of coins later than 209 from Cramond and later than 207 from Carpu has convinced some archaeologists, numismatists, that these sites were abandoned at the latest, immediately after the death of Severus in 211, as Dio says. And indeed it has sometimes even been suggested that they might have been abandoned earlier than that, even on the eve of the Severan campaigns. It's hard, however, to argue away coarse pottery which is published and which appears to date from later in the 3rd century, from Cramond. And as we've seen, the published pottery from Carpu corresponds most closely to the profile of the pottery current at South Shields in the period immediately after the construction of the Severan supply base there, and which is current in the 2nd and 3rd decades of the 3rd century. An analysis of the date distribution of the Severan coins from South Shields, published by John Casey in 1979, showed the same surge in the period between about 200 and 208 as seen at Cramond and Carpu, and the same fall-off in the number of coins dated to the imperial expedition and its aftermath. Yet there is no doubt that South Shields was continuously and busily occupied during the campaigns and after 211. It could be then that the dates of the Severan coins reflect the coin supply rather than the actual period of occupation. And we can recall Dio's statement that Severus, and I quote, took along with him to Britain an immense amount of money. And all of that money, of course, would have to have been minted earlier than 208. It can be argued, I think, that at present the evidence from Cramond and Carpu allows the possibility that these sites were held from some years beyond 211 as coastal outposts north of Hadrian's Wall. If such a system of coastal outposts was one of the legacies of the Severan expedition, it was short-lived. A replanning of South Shields, yet another replanning at this complex site, this time to accommodate the whole of the 5th cohort of Gauls, this probably taking place in the 220s of the 3rd century, might possibly indicate the end of that unit's association with Cramond. Northeastern Scottish society no doubt suffered grievously at the hands of the campaigning army of Severus and Caracalla, and possibly in unrecorded subsequent campaigns in the 3rd century. But it was not ravaged out of existence, for the diplomatic contacts indicated by hordes of silver denarii sent over by the Romans as subsidies, bribes, these continued down to the reign of Severus Alexander, the 220s and 230s. Woodland regeneration in the Roman period, detected by pollen analysis at a number of points in northeast Scotland, has been linked by some with the genocide of the Maiartai in the 2nd Severan campaign. But such changes are as likely to be to do with long-term restructuring of Iron Age society, already discussed, involving an abandonment of older settlement patterns. The change in the pollen is a vaguely dated, centuries-long process which cannot be specifically linked to this Roman campaign or that. The same might be said of the abandonment of the souterrains, those wonderful, mysterious underground chambers which characterise the Iron Age settlements of the Perth Angus focus of the Severan expedition. This is not to deny that these wide-ranging changes were not connected to the presence of the Roman Empire. I'm sure they were, but merely to reject a direct link with the short-term presence or absence of Roman forces or the actions of the Severan campaigns. There is a long historical tradition of seeing the Severan campaigns as successful because of the peaceful state of Britain in the 3rd century. But the so-called 3rd century peace may really be an effect of the silence of the literary sources, which might omit or even have suppressed imperial visits to Britain after 211. Later emperors were to manage the frontier problem in the 4th century in the form of the Picts by aggressive campaigning in Scotland in 305, possibly between 310 and 315, and in 343, 360, 367 and 396-8. But nothing after the Severan expedition has left any archaeological trace. Thank you very much.